Welcome everybody to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I am here with you again with Dr. Stephen Osuna. We are
What's going
picking up
on?
on the second to last, really the last major segment, because I mean, we'll have a full discussion next time, but the last chapter is very short, and then we will look at also the preface and the introduction from or the preface and the forward by Avery Gordon and HLT Kwan next week, and wrap up with things next Wednesday. So, yeah. So, anyways, this has been great to go through this book with you, Stephen, and
Yeah,
we have a good discussion today on
let's do
political
it.
economy, really, and like what Robinson wants to look at in terms of the backdrop of
Hmm.
uh, bourgeois political economy, as well as like the influence of that upon Marxism, especially in the beginning, in the early stages, especially. So,
Yeah, yeah, and just to emphasize, right? I think political economy, but specifically the discourse of political economy, meaning like how it's been discussed, or how it's been developed, right, and our conceptions of it, right? Not necessarily the actual practicality of political economy, right? In that sense, or like how will you do political economy? Because that's a whole other conversation we could have, and we could pull out the Chinese book on political economy. We pulled it out last time, right? But this one's more about the discourse. He's using Foucault in this text, right? So that's something we can talk about too. What do we think? The use of Foucault? But he's using his discourse analysis of Foucault to talk about, unpack how we've understood political economy.
yeah, I mean, that's probably in certain ways the, you know, obviously my radars went up right away when he starts out with
Same here.
the
Same here.
epigraph from Foucault, and like kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
talking about Foucault in the introduction.
Hmm.
um I mean, we could just jump into that part to start. Like, so
Sure.
the epigraph, the quote is, "At the deepest level of Western knowledge, Marxism introduced no real discontinuity. It found its place without difficulty within an epistemological arrangement that welcomed it gladly, since it rested entirely upon it. Marxism exists in 19th century thought like a fish in water. That is, it is unable to breathe anywhere else." I mean, I would take the most strong issue with that last clause. It is unable to breathe anywhere else, because I think
Yeah.
history
Yeah.
shows quite the opposite of that.
For sure.
Um, but I, on one level, I mean, in reading through this chapter too, we'll get into some of it. I mean, I don't disagree with some of the presumptions. The idea that any idea or system of thought or analysis can emerge from somewhere outside of the
Hmm. Hmm.
historical conditions, the institutions of knowledge and study and science, and um, social conditions of a place, right, and a history, right. I just don't believe that, right. I think that that's
Yeah.
actually
For sure.
materialism, right. It's to say that,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
the ideas have to have some kind of foundation in order to really, like, at least in order to resonate and take hold in a certain way. um, they have
Hmm.
to be based. So it does, to me, it's not a kind of gotcha to
No.
suggest that. The question is about really the rupture, right? Of like how much of
Yeah.
it is it a break with bourgeois political economy. And
Hmm.
I still think it is quite a significant break. Um,
Hmm.
but that's part of what is at stake in that discussion. And then as we get into the book, or into the chapter, he gets into, as you say, like some more elements. And really, part of where he goes in this discussion is around, you know the concept of the proletariat, the emphasis on wages, the emphasis on extracted surplus value, and kind of how those calculations are made, and who is not included from some of those calculations, which
Yeah.
honestly is something that a lot of Marxists have spent a lot of time doing work
Unpacking.
around as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that first passage that's just read right now. I think like you just mentioned, right, that it's that Marxism emerges out of this context, And I don't know, when I read this part that Marxism exists in 19th century thought like a fish in water, it goes back to the point where it's emerging out of European thought and it's critiquing European thought. So yeah, it makes sense to me that it's a fish in water. Now, does this fish want to breathe something different or want to move to a different part, or that's the question that you bring up. And I think the part of what is it that Marxism and Marx and Engels do in this period that necessarily challenges Western thought is finding in a way the gaps and really the power relations that were masking capitalist society, right? And so, like, in that sense, while it's a fish in water, in a way, this fish was challenging the water, right? It was like it was not was in. If we're going to keep using this analogy of the water, like it actually was saying we're in water rather than just being a fish in water. It was like this is water. You know what I mean? Like, and so like I think that's the part that's different there. Now, the part when the last part, unable to breathe anywhere else, as we just mentioned, historically, that's just not making sense, right? Because now we know it actually does breathe in a lot of other places, and it's actually been expanded. And in the last chapter, Robinson kind of alludes to that, right? He does mention all these different revolutions that have actually applied Marxism, but also applied it in their context, right? And so the concept of bringing in Foucault to do the discourse analysis, I guess, in a way, he's using Foucault because Foucault is the one that does that discourse analysis. Now, I think there's other Marxists that do it, but Foucault was the one that's kind of like always been used to do this analysis of discourse, right? Unfortunately, from what we've learned about Foucault's French theory and how it's been applied here in the United States, or how it's, the arguments that it's been used to prevent us from studying Marxism more seriously, that's something to contend with, right?
It is, and it's not the only time. I mean, Robinson uses Foucault a bit in Black Marxism as well. He and I get it. Like, on one level, Foucault is an important scholar in the academy and an important critical scholar, right? But like you say, he's one that has been promoted specifically, really to, and part of the reason for this, I think, is this emphasis on kind of, I don't know a lot about French theory, right? So you feel free to correct me from what you know or whatever, but there's this post-structuralist, right? Or like this, really digging into the disciplines, right? And kind of undoing them. And looking at their foundations and critiquing them and really, kind of blowing things up, which in a certain way can lead to a very sort of postmodernist, kind of form of academic work. And so you think about it kind of okay, well, that's a certain sort of analytical weapon from within the academy, but what does it mean to direct that kind of weapon towards Marxism, which is not, in my view, primarily a weapon of the academy, right? But it's been most useful to people's movements historically, in building mass movements and in having revolutions, right? And we can look at all of those projects and those attempts and those processes, and some people read them as failures, right? Or as this, and I think that's kind of maybe where Robinson and I would disagree a little bit, is like that I think he's maybe in a period trying to read some of the failures of those movements and then looking at Marxism and suggesting that that's what led to their failure, rather than where I would say, like, it's imperialism and global capitalism, and it's not something that's just going to, again, to get the discourse on time, right? It's not something that's going to happen quickly, right? Where there's just going to be like, boom, like socialism emerges and it's able to, arrive in its full form and go to war with capitalism, right? And but that actually this is a long struggle, and I mean, I don't know, but I do think, to me, that right off the bat, that introduction to this section does present some problems for me in how Robinson's sort of approaching this, bringing in Foucault right off the bat
Yeah.
to, you know, provide this analysis, which basically is to suggest that Marxism is just a part of European, academic thought, essentially, and fits nicely in there and is sort of welcomed in there, and is not, which is really to sort of deny its revolutionary possibilities and agency, I think, which I have a fundamental issue with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, reading this and thinking about the work that this book does, and what other contemporary folks have done when we're talking about Western Marxism, for me, I think it's also it's distinct from, like, I don't think he's looking at the movements that have used Marxism in the third world. I think he's engaging the Western canon of Marxism in the academic discipline. So and some of us could argue that those are the same thing, but we could also say it's two different things, right? Right? And what he's looking for me is looking at how academics in the Western world have thought of Marxism, and how that Marxism in the Western world has oftentimes blinded us from looking towards the third world, and how those third world revolutions have engaged Marxism on their own terms, right? And that's very distinct, right? And that's created all kinds of ways of understanding that even to this day, people have a problem of how we interpret Marxism in certain places. For example, there's that conception of Marxist Leninism, Maoism. Some people don't even think that that's a point, that it's just Marxist Leninism with Chinese characteristics. While others of us argue, no, actually Mao brought it to another level. It's a whole different approach to Marxist Leninism, right? So that's why some folks refer to it as Maoism. Now, the Western view would be, no, it's not. It's just Leninism, and Mao just did whatever he did to it, right? So I think he's engaging that aspect for me, right, and really questioning how the academic view of Marxism has really, in a way, prevented us from expanding it, right? Because it stays with these views of it just being this history of Western thought, not applying it into the different contexts of Mozambique, of Zimbabwe, of all these different countries that have brought in their own traditions to influence it, right? Not necessarily by revising it, but applying it in the concrete conditions of their terrain. And I think that's the part that I don't necessarily think he's engaging, and I don't think that's the project that he's doing with this. It's more about, let's look at how Western thought has engaged Marxism, and how that in itself has really blinded us, some of us, from viewing the alternative.
Yeah.
And so then in that case, we have these new texts writing about how Marxism has not let us understand, for example, Ali Qadri waste, and how capital produces certain forms of waste, right? And in the very beginning of his book, he talks about it being certain Western Marxists having a Eurocentric view of how we understand the class struggle, right? Or the current book about the Frankfurt School, right? So all these views, I think, are things that he is engaging with, just not necessarily from within the Marxist tradition, I think, right? While these folks, Kadri and them, are coming from within, he's coming from without, right? And looking at how some of us have engaged this historical framework.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, we should move through it, but I think that one of the challenges of how Robinson engages, at least in this book, is, as you say, it's situated strictly within genealogies, I would say, of European thought, and so there's not a bringing in of people's movements, really, other than European people. I mean, he does emphasize and look at European people's movements in this book, which I think is interesting. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we could say, or we could talk about, is, Robinson, maybe if he was thinking about this book within Europe, saying, what would it have meant if Marx was more expansive? Marx and Engels were more expansive in how they engage with the history of people's movements within Europe, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they did engage people's movements. They engaged
Yeah.
working class movements,
Yeah.
right? And also petty bourgeois, artisans,
Mm-hmm.
all this kind of stuff, right? But there are limitations within it, especially
Yeah.
within their era of who
Yeah.
they're thinking about as the revolutionary subject, who they're trying to
Yeah.
organize with in
Mm-hmm.
that period, right? And I think part of what he's saying also is like their predecessors, some of the movements that were predecessors to that had a more expansive
Exactly. Yeah.
mode of organizing people,
Yeah.
and that their movements therefore looked different, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They included, you know, uh, people under feudalism. They included sex workers. They included
Mm-hmm.
women who
Mm-hmm.
were excluded from, political rights and things like this,
Yeah.
right? And they included all kinds of people who were rebelling against the Catholic Church for various
Yeah.
reasons as the kind of order of their day. Um, and I think there's a point there that's important,
Yeah.
within that part of it.
Yeah, and as we've said, right, more contemporary and even not contemporary. I think this, moving from the '60s off '70s, you've had movements that have engaged these questions, right? Specifically through a Marxist lens, right? That how do you engage forms of labor that are not necessarily waged, right? Or ways of struggles that are not necessarily about wage labor, right? That are not in the factory, right? Some of us haven't thought about how do you think about the issue of policing and state violence through a Marxist lens, right? How do you think the issues of the environment through the Marxist lens, right? So I think some of us have engaged these questions through the Marxist framework, right? And seen what we could build from that rather than saying that, well, it's not useful. And again, I go back to the point that we've been saying multiple times. He's not saying that it's not useful. He's just saying how do we expand it, right? Or what have been the limitations, and how oftentimes these limitations have blinded some of us from seeing an alternative, right? And I go back to that point of some of us, because some of us have not. Some of us have built off of these things, right? Unfortunately, some folks just, yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably before we move in, just to cite one more frustration. And this is a frustration that also shows up for me in reading Black Marxism. And I've probably referenced it already on this, these conversations. But he will say things like Marxists, right? And just put that,
Yeah.
right? Rather than saying some Marxists or
Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
particular individuals and name
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
right? Or right. And in Black Marxism, particularly in the third section, there's like slippage that exists, right? Where it's like, well, sometimes you're talking about the Socialist Party. Sometimes you're talking about the CPUSA. Sometimes you're talking about Stalin.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're talking about Lenin.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're talking about Marx. Sometimes you're talking about Engels. And there's a little bit of like I was playing with the title a little bit today. I was like, is this an anthropology of Marxology? Is it an anthropology of Marx and
Mm-hmm.
Engels? Right? Like, because
Mm-hmm.
um I don't I have an issue at the level of terminology and specificity sometimes within Robinson's writing when he's talking about, because it feels like he wants to paint everything with the same brush
Yeah.
sometimes, when it does require more specificity to differentiate, to say, when I say Marxism here, I'm not talking about Mao.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about what Lenin said here. I'm talking about what Marx said in
Yeah.
62, or something like that,
Yeah.
right? And those are not there's a little bit of treating it for sure like a dogma, a doctrine, a religion, a theology, um, where he wants to distill certain um, doctrine from it and say these are the doctrine of Marxism and here's where they are wrong. And what I would say is that a Marxism that is useful to movements is not doctrinal, it is not dogmatic, it is not
Yeah. Yeah.
theological, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't take any presumption that Marx or Engels might have had and hold that as something that we have to hold on to.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's probably my most profound difference, I would say, in how I would orient myself towards Marxism is
Yeah.
I'm like, if the point of view is to kind of decenter reading all of Marx's, corpus of literature as the most important thing that we should do as Marxists, I agree. Right? I don't think that's the most important thing, is for you to have read Capital Volume 1, 2, 3, and every, thing from the 18th Brumaire to, you know, German
Yeah.
ideology and all of that. I think those are good books, and I think people should read them. I think
Yeah.
I don't want to dissuade people from that, but I think that there's a lot to learn from the the people's movements, from the revolutions, from other theorists within the tradition, right? That you shouldn't confine yourself to looking for, some kind of transhistorical truth within the work of Marx and Engels.
Yeah. Yeah.
I agree with that point.
Yeah. That's definitely yeah, that's a really good point, right? You know, as and it's so funny you say that because I tend to, yeah, I agree with that. And at the same time, I'm on the other end where I'm like, nah, but you got to read that. I'm like, you still got to read those things. You should, I
Yes.
think, because
Yes.
again, like, to understand just like what he's doing with the work he's doing here of like the discourse of economics, and he's like trying to put it upside his head, like where does it come from? I feel the same way about folks that are reading, contemporary Marxists, to be like, well, where they're getting their ideas of Marx, right? And how can you should go back and read Marx to see how you're going to apply that method, that analysis, right? You should read Capital to understand, with a study group, to understand how does that reflect to your contemporary issues, right? Instead of saying, well, I just read this one person, I don't got to read that. I'm like, yeah, you do. You still should, right? Just the same thing that we've been saying all along with this, right? Just because you read Black Marxists doesn't mean you don't read Marx now, right? Or engage Marxism, right? Because he's not saying don't engage it, right? He's saying that just what are the limitations, right? So definitely, yeah, right. But then the problem becomes, as you were just saying, on the contradiction of that, is that some people then just get stuck there and don't read contemporary movements, or don't see how the movements have reshaped it and use it as a tool for action, not just a theory, but a tool, right? And actually put it into praxis, right? And I think that's where, for example, when we go back to reading Mao, that's what's very useful to think about how he's wrote it on practice, on contradiction, all these different essays that he's written to show us how you put this into practice, right? And there's so many movements contemporary that have then written their own ways of thinking about this. If you look at the movements in the Philippines, you think about the way they write about SICA, right? Social investigation, class analysis. Like, how do you do that work? Like concrete work of actually building a movement alongside through a Marxist lens. That is not just theory, that is actually practice, right? But again, that's not necessarily something you're going to get from Marx. You're going to get that from movements that have built off of the ideas of Marx, right?
Yeah. Totally agree. There was a note
Mhm.
that I wrote down as I was like, which is, it's a Mao. I don't know if anybody said this before Mao, but I know it's in Mao. But social practice is the criterion for truth, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's something that Daruba Ben Wahad, repeats as well. And I think it's a really that was, as I was reading this today, today, yesterday, preparing for this, that was part of what I feel like is a Marxist perspective, right, from Mao, that is missing from how Robinson is relating to
Mhm.
Marxism, right? Because
Mhm.
the criterion for truth is not that Marx or Engels said something,
Mhm.
right? The criterion for
Mhm.
truth is, taking the tools, applying it to movements, and seeing, does this work or not? And if it
Mhm.
doesn't, then you have to figure out, okay, how do we adapt? What have we misanalyzed? What's different within our conditions that we need to
Mhm.
incorporate into this,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's the piece for me. When we think about Marxism as a science, that's the science of it,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It is the
Mhm.
science of practice,
Of
of
practice.
revolution,
Mhm.
And so
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
and
not, you won't get that here. That's, you know, yeah, that's not, I don't think that's the project here, right? That's,
no,
yeah, no,
no, and
exactly.
and I mean, to be
Yeah,
clear, it's not what he's trying to do, but I just
yeah,
think
yeah,
that for me to love this book more than I do, that's what I would want the project to
yeah,
be.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, no, definitely. I think that's
Would
that.
be to say
Yeah,
like, okay, you know, in this movement, they tried it with this point of view, it didn't work, and then they adapted it and said, okay, given these conditions, right? Because one of the things a point he makes later on, right, is to look at history of revolutions and to say, actually, it wasn't the industrial proletariat, right, that were the most decisive factor within Russia,
mm-hmm.
within China, within, right, and he goes on,
Mexico.
he lists
Yeah,
a bunch,
yeah,
Mexico, right, so and on and on. And I would say I agree, right, but to me that shouldn't dismiss Marxism. It should be incorporated into our analysis of Marxism, right, as
yeah,
a
yeah,
study.
yeah.
Yeah.
Understood. Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
all right.
All right. So let's continue. And so let me see. So yeah, but it goes back. You know, if, even in the first sentence of this, after that epigraph, right? In the service of a liberationist project, Marxism proposes itself as a radical and antagonistic break with the epistemological assumptions and the ideological pretensions of its bourgeois competitors. The disavowal is a part of the revolutionary project since it exposes what is otherwise concealed, the historical tendency of capitalism to offend just order by the expropriation from the many and the accumulation of wealth by the few. As its opposition, Marxism, we are assured, is the expression of the oppressed, a forensic science to capitalism's profound criminality. And with respect to bourgeois political economy, Althusser insisted, Marx's critique of political economy is therefore a very radical one. It queries not only the object political economy, but also political economy itself as an object. Right? So it's kind of like he's setting it up the point that this is what it says about itself again, right? This is what people have argued Marxism to be. Um, I don't think he necessarily is disagreeing with it, but what he's doing is like, however, the fact that it says it's the break and that it's challenging its competitors, which is the bourgeois, it's still relying on its ideas. Right? It's still relying on its conceptions of itself, right? But the part that's really important here for me is that one thing that Marx and Engels have said that, well, specifically Engels says that what Marx found that other bourgeois economists weren't doing is that that he was able to explain surplus value and the idea that where's the passage? Is it? Oh, the disavow is part of the revolution project since it exposes what is otherwise concealed, the historical tendency of capitalism to offend just order by the expropriation from the many and the accumulation of wealth by the few. Right, kind of like the point that's what stood out with Marxism, right? That Marx was able to show what Ricardo, Adam Smith, and all these other dudes were concealing. Right?
Yeah. And I mean, I agree. I think that's a little bit reductive.
Mm-hmm.
Um but I don't.
There's more. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Um so from there for me, like I kind of moved into the concealed origins of Western economic thought. I don't know if you had more to say on that little introductory
Well,
section.
I think in that introduction section, before we get to the concealment, is that passage that he says, right, that this is the paragraph right before that section. That alternatively, if a socialist discourse can be recovered from earlier pre-capitalist eras, such as discovery would rupture the epochal confines of bourgeois epistemology sacred to both liberalism and Marxism. More pointedly, with respect to socialist discourse itself, such a revelation would throw into doubt the preclusiveness of a revolutionary program whose singular historical agencies were the industrial laboring classes and a renegade bourgeoisie. The demonstration of an older and enduring oppositional discourse on poverty and property might then emancipate socialism from the ideological regime rigidly subscribed by an attenuated and bourgeois construction of class struggle. The resistance to capitalism could then be understood as a derivative oppositional discourse whose origins suggest a submerged and perhaps more profound historical crisis. That to me was the part that I thought was more useful, the part of like the profound historical crisis that I think is going back to just this idea, like how do we unpack Western civilization itself and how it started to develop, that this critique of itself has existed before even capitalism was already there, right? That the relationships of property and ownership of wealth, that the critiques of that thing as it was emerging in Western Europe already had its contradiction, right? That it wasn't until Marx that the contradiction emerged, that there was already these rebellious views towards it and attempts to create an alternative even before Marxism, right? And I think that's for me what's useful here, right? That when we want to think of Western civilization or Western Europe, that these renegades and rebellious intellectuals and movements prior to Marx existed, and that we could point towards, right? And be like, look, there was always a problem out there. There was always a contradiction out there that folks were fighting against, right? That it wasn't until Marx that this happened. It was before him too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I agree with the implications, right? So I agree that if you're only focused upon the working class, wage labor, surplus value, and the accumulation of wealth among the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, I mean, one that lends itself to, what we call a Western Marxist viewpoint that doesn't, de-emphasizes imperialism, doesn't look at things like unequal exchange, doesn't look at social reproduction as a serious site of, meaning like women's labor, so-called, or the labor of, which we'll get into in this, the labor of the home, is one of the things that he talks about in this, and particularly the implications for enslavement, right? And what does it mean if you don't receive a wage, right? And I mean, we can bring it up. There's obviously a lot of people who have taken a Marxist approach to those questions, whether it's Sylvia Frederici, Selma James, Eric Williams, CLR James, and on and on and on, right? We could think of all of these people who have done work on capitalism and slavery. Ali Kadri with Accumulation of Waste is looking at actually just the role of destroying and reducing human lives in accumulation, right? And there's a lot of areas that you can go. And I think one of the things that Ali Kadri talks about that I really appreciate too is he actually de-emphasizes in a certain way quantitative measurements, which is to say we can't actually quantify, and that at some point, what is the point of quantifying it all, right? Because it's like you could come up with some number that is so large, it's trillions of dollars, and you want reparations for that. On a certain level, Kadri makes the point of like the capitalists at a certain point might pay some massive amount because they still control the printing of money. They still control, it becomes recirculation of money, and then it all will get reabsorbed back into the system, and if you're not changing the fundamental system, then the problem of circulation can be resolved within it, right? And so I think all of those are important things. And so all I'm saying is that I think that he's on to something, here in terms of a limit if we just focus on it, which is not to say that we shouldn't focus on it or that it's not important or that it is not of an important contribution, because I think that it is, but it's not the only one.
And again, the point that the resistance to capitalism could then be understood as derivative oppositional discourse, right? Like you just described Ali Kadri's work, right? That this is beyond just even that there's more to question than just the relations of production, right? That there's all these different issues or areas that emerge because of the relations of production, right? But dialectically, there's all these things that we must be having to contend with beyond just that, right? The way we, and that creates a profound historical crisis, right? That we need to challenge, right? Because you were just talking about earlier, right? That if we just get bogged down by quantitative issues or just numbers, we start just focusing on wages. We start focusing on just access to better working conditions, which is an important area that we fight for. But beyond that, there's so much more. Our way of life, right, is very important in this current moment with the ecological destruction, right? Our way of seeing other parts of the world, right, of how we relate to each other. Those fundamental things have distorted our relationships, right? And so I think that's the part where it's to me crucial to think about what he's arguing.
Yeah. So the concealed origins of Western economic thought. I mean, he goes here back into Greece, essentially. Aristophanes, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle, right? So he's looking from like 300 BC through 450. I mean, BC through 450 BC, right? So he's looking way back. And part of what he wants to do is look at Greek society. He wants to look at economics there, class struggle there, who was considered a subject or a citizen, who was not. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what I was gonna say here pretty much is a critique of this one. I don't know who they are, right? It's John Kenneth Galbraith. He has a book called The History of Economics. And I think it's pretty much a critique of him, really, because he's saying like, or economists in general, because they construct this idea of that classical economics begins with Adam Smith and these folks, and he's like, because of the idea of the market, right? That there was no market prior to this, and so that economists did not exist back then. It was until these classic economics that we have economics, and he quotes this part here, right? Economics in all modern manifestations centers on the market. In a world in which the markets was a subsidiary, even esoteric aspect of life, economics as is now known still did not exist, right? And so that's the part, right, that I think he begins with. And this is the whole book's really, this chapter really is building off that one guy. Again, I haven't read his work or I didn't research him in time for this, but this is where he's building off the critique out of this person Galbraith, right? It's a 1987 book on history of economics, right? And so then, as you're saying, he builds off of that to be like, well, actually, all these other dudes before classical economics were talking about economics and how we think of economics, right? And I think it goes back to goes back to this whole point of trying to build on the critique of the market, right? And that all these dudes have been got caught up with just talking about the market. And it's like beyond the market that we should be referring to when we think about economics. It's not just the market, but that's how people have gotten caught up thinking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just looking him up in particular. He's an influential Democratic Party economist. He served in the administrations of FDR, Truman, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. And he was the ambassador to India for a while from the U.S.
Well, traditional intellectual, and the Gramscian sense.
Yeah, exactly. So not a radical.
No, not a radical for it. But again, it's like how then the dominant view of economics is perceived, right? The liberal view of economics.
Totally. And I mean, he gets into this, but like, if just for people to think about it nowadays, right? When we talk about the economy, like, what are the metrics of it that we use? We use GDP, we use, unemployment figures, right? We use, wages, job creation, right?
That's
These
right,
kind of statistics. And, that field it obscures a lot, right? There's a whole lot going on
Yeah,
there.
that's right.
And, you know, Marxists and others are key to kind of breaking up and talking about all
Hmm.
the things that are obscured there. Yeah.
Hmm. For sure.
But yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the part, right, that again you and I keep going back onto, right? There's already Marxists that have been challenging that. While there's Marxists that continue it on that route and follow that tradition, like they, as much as they're blinded by bourgeois economy, there's a lot of us that don't. You know what I mean? That have, and I think it's, I think it's also the point that this dude wrote this, what, like 99? Now, I'm not going to say that there wasn't Marxists before that doing this work already, but, we are in what, 2025, 26 now. There's been 26 years since this book was published.
Mm-hmm.
Is it 99? I think so, right?
Yeah, it's published in
2001, 2001,
2000. Yeah.
2001, right?
Yeah.
And then plus that, these were lectures from the 80s, right? And so like a lot of us have already built on these ideas, and so like I think it's also we have to read this in its context, just like we read every other work in its context. And it's so a lot of us have already built off of this stuff, right? Have
Yeah.
critiqued this stuff already that he's been critiquing, right?
Yeah, and I think Robinson saw and I don't he saw, I think, Marxism on the decline, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even, Black Marxism comes out 83, you have the fall of the Soviet Union at the end of, the in the 90s, whatever people's positions are on China now, like they have a very,
Mm-hmm.
rightward shift in this period,
Mm-hmm.
marketization and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think in the times that he's writing, these ideas are becoming are more and more challenged, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I see him as kind of engaging in this of trying to create a basis of upholding ideas of socialism and communism, right? But maybe saying that we could look elsewhere, or that there's other histories that we could talk about this. We don't
yeah,
have to be so Marxist centric in a certain way,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Or,
Which
or, or
I
really, or really, towards the end, he mentions these other Marxist feminists, capital centric, right? That
mhm,
we build our analysis off of capitalism rather than alternatives, right?
yeah,
That our Marxist analysis is constantly viewing capitalism as,
mhm,
and we build our analysis off of that rather than building it from the outside of it, outside of
yeah,
capitalism. We're always building from within it, right? And so, like, for example, during the 80s, this dude spends time in Nicaragua, and if there's some of these interviews, just talk about like, well, he saw something different in Nicaragua, that these movements, the Sandinista movement that was developing at the time, had a Marxist-Leninist lens, but it also had other lenses within it. And some people argue that, well, where the Sandinista movement is at now could be a result of that. But the questions that he's bringing up is that, right? That how do we see different movements building alongside a socialist alternative, right? That oftentimes some of us might be blinded from because we follow the Marxist line. It's just this perspective only. Right?
yeah. I just want to say to live, a few people have said it's buffering. I'm
Oh,
sorry about that. It seems to be okay on our end for both of us, so it must be like kind of a YouTube issue right now, and hopefully it'll sort itself out. It seems like it's good now from folks in the chat, but let us know. So I mean, one of the things that's interesting in here is he digs into the oikos, right?
mm-hmm.
Which, this whole part brought me back to home economics.
Yeah. High school? Are you talking about high school?
Yeah, like
Dude, at least you
high
took that. They
school,
didn't
middle
give me
school.
that. They didn't give me any of that, man.
We had
Anyway.
home ec in middle school at my school in the 90s. And what it was, people might not, I don't think they teach it at all anymore. And it's kind of funny because it reminded me of this conversation we just had with Arlene Eisen, who was in school in the 50s, and she got some award for getting the highest IQ test of the Betty Crocker Future Homemaker of America.
Oh shit.
Crazy, right? But like what home economics was it didn't really have anything to do with economics.
No.
But it did actually. But what it was like learning how to cook, learning how to bake, and learning how to sew. Those were the primary things that we were learning in home economics was cooking, baking, and sewing. And there might have been a few other things, but that was the main thing. And it's very interesting, right? Because really what you're teaching kids, teens, is how to do the work of social reproduction, right? Like how do you
Mm-hmm.
feed your family? Like how do you repair clothing or make clothing? All of these
Mm-hmm.
kind of things. And it's really interesting because when he's talking about the oikos and economics being the terrain of the women within Greek society in a certain way, and the oikos being the household, right? But the household being an economic unit, which in certain ways, that's also something that we still have within economy in like the United States, right? We do
Yeah.
household income, we do household taxes, like in a lot of ways, right? Um, when you do your taxes, they want to know how many people are in your house and what the total income is of the house and all of that. Um, but I found that was really kind of interesting as him talking about the oikos in that respect, and me thinking about like, oh yeah, they were teaching us they were teaching us how to socially reproduce ourselves in middle school.
Huh. That's interesting that you said that you bring that up because again, like I know we're going off tangent, but man, our school didn't teach us none of that, man. I didn't even get that. We were just surplus where we were at with my school. You know what I mean? They weren't giving us any of like how to reproduce ourselves. Um, but yeah, in this section, it goes back to like these different theorists or these different individuals back before classical political economy and saying, well, these dudes were also developing their own ways of understanding the economy, understanding relations of work, right? It goes back to Plato, Aristotle, right? Um, but yeah, I just it goes back to, for me, this section was really just about saying that, that our conception or the bourgeois conception of classical economics actually is misleading because there's so much more before that, right? That oftentimes gets ignored for reasons of, again, his whole argument of the book that the classical economics created a story of themselves about being the bourgeoisie, right? And they're the ones that led the economy. They're the ones that brought us into civilization, right? And so that before that there wasn't anything.
Yeah, so one section, I mean, one, he's trying to break apart, yeah, this discussion of like modernity, and when does economics actually become real economics, and this kind of discussion. But I think one of the things, just to like, he has the early up, this is a quote from Shops, who's one of the people. He says that, quote, the early upbringing of children, the management of domestic slaves, and the production of food and clothing were matters of great importance to Greek women, right? And he goes into all of this, right? But like, this is part of what he's, just to be clear for folks, of what he's looking at within Greek society is like you said, like the men, the citizen man becomes the unit basically
Mm-hmm.
of, you know, it becomes the subject within the society, right? The one that actually has some kind of, is seen as having some kind of agency, participation in democracy, and so on. But it also, the exclusion is of women, children, and enslaved
Mm-hmm.
people, right? And so even though the
Yeah.
slavery we're talking about here is different than like chattel slavery and, in transatlantic slave trade and all of that, Robinson's saying that these the removal of all of these sectors from economy from the beginning, becomes the way that bourgeois economy, the basis of bourgeois economy, as it gets developed over time. That's the way I read it.
Mm-hmm. And just again, it goes back to he has a point here that says that socialist discourse in economics was already being developed before classical, right? And that's something that he
Yep.
wants to highlight, right? That there is already these conversations of socialist discourse happening prior to classical economics, right? And he quotes this one poem or this one play, right, about Aristophanes' play, right? And so I think that's, again, he's going back to the same point that we've been reiterating, right? That there is already this socialist impulse developing way back then. And again, I find so much value to that because it goes back to there's always been an attempt of an alternative, right? And again, that sounds so simple to say, but at the same time profound, right? That I think it's contradictory, right? Where I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever, yeah, there's always been that, but it's still a very profound thing because the common sense idea that for example, in the community I'm from, it's always been this common sense idea that there's always been rich people, there's always been poor people. That's just the way it is. I'm not sure how that happens with you guys, right? But it's always been the conversation around people you're trying to organize. It's always been like this. It's always been rich people. There's always been poor people. Just get over it. That's what it is. Well, now I could go back and be like, well, there's always been a socialist impulse. There's always been a socialist impulse, right? Even before Jesus, because we always talk about Jesus being the first communist. Well, even before Jesus, right, there was already the socialist impulse of an alternative, and we just have been blinded from it. We've been told that there wasn't. That it wasn't until the 18th century that some guy named Marx created this idea. Like, no, dude, there's always been a socialist impulse that Marx then just put together and just got the ideas of his moment, of his conjunctural moment, and wrote it together, right? And I think that's the profound idea for me, right? And again, he's not the first to say that either, right? He's not the last to say that. You know? But that's something that this is being offered in this section.
I just want to bring up something that so Stephen is Gen X, and so probably got even more home ec than I did, and you didn't get any. But I just want to raise this point because I think it's important. So it's like all those home ec activities have been completely commodified now. Cooking with food delivery, sewing with disposable clothes, everything. Like we could also talk about like the drop off like laundromats and stuff like this, like like dry cleaners, where you take individual items to. Steven said, talking to Yipper, in the olden days, you had to go to the bank to check your balance. You also wrote checks, right? And I think, the other thing that we mentioned is that you learn to balance your checkbook there. But I think like what's interesting about that to talk about just for a minute is one, that the promotion of home economics was in part a product of capitalism itself, right? Because it also was to say, I mean, we could say it goes back further than that because Robinson's saying, it's going on in ancient Greece here. But like, it was to say that the responsibility of, reproducing the workforce, right, and providing for the worker belonged to the household, right? It was the woman's responsibility, right, to do these things and to raise the children and stuff like that. And there is, when we talk about like Project 2025 and the conservative impulse, there's an impulse to return to that, right? To say actually, and so you could see the promotion again of home economics under that sort of lens. But then on top of that, there's another impulse, right? Which is that capitalism is about endless growth and it's always looking for new markets to conquer. And if it says, hey, if we can commodify further every form of socially reproductive labor that you do and make more money off of it, this is Pramila Nadison's work on the care economy, right? Of like all the ways that they look then to figure out how to monetize, like, I mean, obviously the privatization of healthcare, but like it goes deeper and deeper and deeper and continues to get into our lives and figure out how many ways can I extract a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there from this system. And one of the ways that it does it is to provide you these services of, you don't have to do that socially reproductive labor because we'll cook your meals and send them to you, or we'll, all these things, right? And so it's a very interesting thing because there's multiple methods there of exploitation, but also of extraction that are going on. And again, I think a Marxist analysis provides us the best framework to be able to dig
Yeah,
it into
no,
all
for
those
sure.
things.
For sure. I think, when I think about that, I always like refer to my students to remember that capitalism is not only expansive, it expands, it internalizes, right? So it internalizes and it commodifies externally and internally. So like that way that you say it expands, imperial expansion, but then how does it internally start to commodify, like you just mentioned, everyday life, right? All the different things in our everyday activities have been commodified to the point of like you just said, anything you can pretty much buy, right? I can sit here right now and I don't have to do anything. I could order my food. I don't have to cook it anymore. I could have someone clean my house. I could have someone wash my clothes, right?
Yeah, and you
What
can go into
I
debt that you
yeah,
won't be able to pay and
yeah.
that your
I,
kids will be saddled with, like,
at
yeah.
what point can I just sit here and someone come brush my teeth? You know what I mean? Like, like that's like those are the levels of internal commodification that happen. That then, it's so funny that we're talking about home ec, but yeah, it's like that was a certain time of the I'm sure the Make America Great idea of like we all need to go back and take home ec again, right? Well, the ones that were in surplus, because again, like I mentioned, we were just didn't get they didn't get that at all.
Well, but
But
I think that you all were targeted for the neoliberalism first, right? They were
yeah, I
like,
know, I know.
they were like, we don't care if you are able to socially reproduce yourself, Stephen. Like you're expendable.
You're expendable, like we'll just throw you in the prison. You know what I mean? But yeah, I think that's a pretty powerful point that we're bringing up here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So continuing on. I mean, I think like just to go to kind of those last couple of paragraphs. Robinson says, in the ancient world, if Plato and Aristotle are any measure, political and ideological considerations obliterated the real and necessary significance of slaves. And in the modern world, similar sensitivities segregated the manufacturing and industrial workforces of the metropole from extractive workers of the periphery. A labor granted visibility by wage capital relations and production consumption priorities served, for example, as the genotype for Marx's industrial workers or the national workforces treated in bourgeois economics. Invisible labor, the slaves to whom Aristotle and Plato infrequently referred when ruminating on the objectives of virtue or justice, became the rationale among modern economic thinkers, including Marx, for the dismissive treatment of slaves, peasants, coerced laborers, colonial workers, and others, the lumpen proletariat, who presumably lacked agency. Paradoxically, in their pursuit of a critical economics, Marx and Engels embraced the exclusivist precepts of a market economics while resolving to recenter their venture on the activity of the lower classes. In sum, then, despite the disclaimers so frequently voiced by historians of science, it may be surmised that the empirical, conceptual, and moral precepts of the ancients did have consequences for modern economic thought. From those ancients, genetic discursive faults can be traced to socialist imaginings, as well as to economic constructions pertaining to the domains of women and workforces presumed extraneous by virtue of location, politics, divisions of labor, and race, right? And so I think it's a good, I think that's it's just an important thing for folks to consider within their analysis,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Which we continue to still have these conversations about, right? Like how the idea of, what's the name? We talked about the aristocracy of labor, right? We have that conversation about that term, right? But the idea that we oftentimes neglect to think about, even like social democracy, right? That if you're going to build social democracy here, that's off the benefits of imperialism, right? That conversation is a constant one that needs to be reminded, right? That as much as we want to build, some folks, well, just regionally social democracy here, yeah, but that still doesn't change the relationships of empire, right? The imperial relationship still as a structure still exists. You might get your benefits here, but what is it? How does it off of whose backs, right? And I think that still exists in our current conversations and in these debates. And what he's saying is that that our framing emerges out of these concepts way back, right? That even to this day, even under some Marxist analysis, that this still continues to frame it, and
Yeah.
and again, it's a contradiction that we have to contend with.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that, within people who want to take, so one of the things about Marxism that we could say, right, is that it is not any single one thing, right? And so people have taken the tools of Marx, including the writings of Marx, to justify exactly the positions, and still do. Like, there are still there are living organizations, people, etc., that do exactly what he's critiquing these economists and Marx of doing. And there are also people who have used the tools of Marx to actually extend his work into their terrains to show this is what that exploitation and extraction looks like from this point of view, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of it, our orientation towards Marxism, our political orientation towards it, and our projects can dictate how we use those tools too, right? And I think that's the thing, is you don't want to get into, if we think about Marxism as a set of tools, then you don't want to fetishize those tools either, and say,
exactly,
like, okay, well, he was right about everything then, so therefore we're going to go with that, and we're not paying attention to any of this other stuff. Yeah. All right, so the next section is socialist discourse in the medieval and Reformation eras. This is similar. I mean, he's kind of revisiting some of chapter 2 when we talked about some of those renegade socio-religious descendants and rebels of the Middle Ages.
But he focuses on that one dude, Marcellus de Mainardini.
Yep.
And just his thoughts, right, and his analysis of property and the church, right? Again, going back to the questions of the critiquing the church, right, of the Roman Catholic Church. Let me see.
Yeah, so one of the things he says is he envisioned a perfect regime, he puts that in quotes, which eschewed utopianism by founding his proposed community on what he proposed as the history of human development and the observations recorded by Aristotle, the foremost philosophers in his civil science, the politics, right? And so it's interesting, in a certain way, because it's like, again, another one of these figures that in some ways takes, as he talked about early on, Engels and Lenin, right, saying, oh, Marx elaborated upon, the foremost thinkers in, what was it, British political science, French socialism, and German philosophy, right? It's a similar kind of thing. Yeah. And he's talking about a socialist discourse that, he's involved in, basically, Marcellus, in elaborating in the medieval and the Reformation era in particular.
Yeah, and again, things that I feel like, I've come across just in my experience of being in El Salvador with liberation theologians, right? On page 103, the true apostle of Christ would embrace poverty and equality, not property and privilege, right? These are, again, there's the history to these dudes. So when I think of liberation theology as something emerging in the 70s or 60s, 70s in America, like, well, these were its precursors, right? Like way back in this period, right? That I oftentimes didn't think about, right? I thought, so I think, that's an important reflection for me to look at these dudes from the past. The Marcellus's communalisms, right? Again, I didn't even know of this dude.
Yeah. No, I didn't. I didn't either.
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
Yeah. No, go on. No,
you got it.
I was gonna go move on because again, going back to that chapter, I think last week when we were talking about the Jesuits, he says it in this part. He says that, these Europeans were looking at the Jesuits as like, an example of socialist tenets, but let's remember that it was far from democratic or idyllic. He finally says it here, right? In the previous chapter, he didn't say that, but here's like page 108. Notwithstanding, while the missions helped to preserve or transmit a socialist impulse, in reality, they were never idyllic or democratic. And obviously that could also be a critique of like, well, how socialism oftentimes has been constructed, that it oftentimes cannot be idyllic or democratic, right? But the impulse is there, right, to build something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, he ends that, as we observed in chapter 2, the legends incited by the existence of these missions inspired the imaginations of bourgeois Europeans in the 18th century. Socialist utopia reappeared in the writings of secular philosophers, novelists, playwrights, and pamphleteers, extending socialist principles to the consciousness of the new middle classes. And as these classes increased in self-confidence and social ambitions, socialist ideas served as a basis for the critique of the classes which dominated them and the state structures which nurtured their formation.
Yeah, so again, I think the building of the socialist ideas prior that influenced these movements at the time that we oftentimes don't know about, right? So he's just again a deep dive into Western civilization, Western history that we oftentimes don't read. Sometimes don't even care to think about, right? For what? Like we're in the current moment. Why look far back then? But again, I think it's useful for those of us that want to have more of a when we do political education, like looking at these pasts and being like, look, dude, there is always these moments, right? There's always these alternative impulses. And so it wasn't just, that's just the way it is. A lot of us that have to contend with the common sense, like thinking of Gramsci and the common sense, here's examples of being like, nah, dude, like it wasn't always this way, right? There's always an impulse. We could like really turn that on its head when people are like, well, it's just the way it is. Yeah, that's just the way it is. There's always been a socialist impulse, and just means one day we're gonna really build off of that, right? So yeah. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it was Terry Frick Chittimak in the chat that said recently, I mean, I don't remember. I think she said this, but it's I've heard other people say it as well. But just like if Europeans knew their history, that they'd be more radicalized by it,
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
And I think that's like, I think there might be a good argument that like Europeans and Euro descended people like know our history the least out of a lot of groups of people, in the world. I mean, I think obscuring history is something that's generally done, right? In all societies, like you kind of want to, make it, you want to tell these stories and these national mythologies and, promote the bourgeoisie, promote your rulers, right? I mean, my kids are in public school. You get all this crap about, George Washington and fucking Hamilton and all this shit, and it's just like, oh God, like, these are not, this is not the history that we should be taught, right? But I think it is particularly true. Like I took even AP European history in high school, which is like much deeper dive and does deal a little bit with communism, right? And a little bit with like the Cold War and all that stuff, because it has this big impact on European history. But it doesn't deal at all with like the periods that Robinson is talking about, and it certainly doesn't deal with any of it in the way that he does, where he's like looking at struggle, right? These different struggles that are going on. So anyway.
It's funny you bring that up, because I took my kid's 5, we took him to the library down the street, right? We went into the library, went to the kids section, and I'm perusing at the different books, and I find a section on politics, and they had 3 books: fascism, communism, theocracy. There's nothing about bourgeois democracy, because that's the thing we breathe and we don't have to think about. right? That's
Yeah.
just what it is. That's the normal standard. And these are the
Yeah.
three things that have veered off of, all right? Theocracy in Iran, and they have a picture of Iran in the book. And then communism, we have a picture, I think, of Mao. And then fascism, they have a picture of Mussolini, right? But again, the founding fathers you just described were fine. That's the standard, right? That's the baseline. And all these other three things are the ones that have veered towards awful directions, right? I opened up the communism one, and they have a picture of Mao and the Great Leap Forward and the disaster of the Great Leap Forward.
Yeah.
And nothing about colonialism or the history of empire in China and the famines that it created. No. This period was awful. Right?
Yeah.
And same thing with theocracy, right? Oh no, nothing about the 54 coup or any of that. It's just no. It's just these people that just are just awful, right? They're evil.
Yeah.
And so, but again, this history is showing us otherwise, right? And I think goes
Absolutely.
back to that very first line in that introduction about there's a deeper historical crisis, profound historical crisis at hand that we need to unpack that we don't. Right?
Yep. All right. So Marxian economics.
Yeah.
So what were some of your key takeaways here?
Where was it? I think part here where he says, there's this section where like, if statism and eventually nationalism were their creeds, talking about the bourgeoisie, and political economy was the catechism of the ascending capitalist class, and it was an antagonist within this discourse rather than an adherence to medieval socialism, Marxian socialism arose, right? So I was going back to that point that we were saying earlier, right? That our building off of us, oftentimes our analysis or how we build our view is oftentimes in opposition to capitalism. We're anti-capitalist. And here he's saying that that's how capitalism developed, rather than saying I'm building off of the medieval socialist traditions that existed. What would it look like, or what would it have been? And again, we don't have to necessarily. There's more of an intellectual conversation here. Is there really need for that? Of what would it have been like instead that we would have built off the medieval socialist tradition rather than in opposition to capitalism? Would that have made something different? Would have that given us a different lens to think about things? Maybe he could argue that at that moment, then we would have built in a whole different type of agents. Different agents would have been the revolutionary subjects. But again, that's just putting out fingers and just thinking. It's not necessarily historical to do that now.
Right. One of the things that interventions that I've appreciated, is the work of Chris Gilbert, and he's working off of like Meszaros and Chavez, right? And in his analysis, his kind of breaking down, like, Samir Amin used to say that the Soviet Union fell between two stools or something like this, like that it was like that it was like part capitalism. I'm gonna fuck up this metaphor, so I'm gonna let it go. But point being that, like, what Meszaros then basically analyzed was that you actually had to build up a socialist metabolism, right? That he thinks of capitalism as a metabolic system, as like a body, right? And that in order to compete with it, that it's inadequate for a state to just, as has been the case, Torkel Lawson does a great job of showing this. With every socialist attempt or project, it has incorporated capitalism to a certain degree, because we actually we haven't actually really achieved socialism, right? Only the USSR, I think, claimed to have achieved socialism, but everywhere else that has tried to, right, has said, like, we're trying to build the conditions for socialism, right? We're a socialist state or a communist state, but we're trying to build those grounds. And one of the ways that you have to do it is through capitalism, essentially, because you still have to do trade, you still have to accumulate wealth, right? And then what's different is that those societies can determine how to redistribute those things differently than a capitalist system would choose to, right? So if we're talking about Cuba, USSR, China, et cetera, right? But what Meszaros kind of proposed was that there were some things that were wrong with the 20th century attempts, and that it's like building the communes, right? Building out those units of socialist organization where you have more direct democracy over what's produced, how the work is done, etc. That these become building blocks for socialism in a way that doesn't easily transition within like the USSR or the China model. This is his argument, at
Mm-hmm.
least, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's interesting because part of what that is an attempt to do, right? And I know people could have different opinions on that. People could say, no, you got to do it the other way, da 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 da. But it's an attempt to say we need to build off of like what is socialism, how does it work, and try to scale these things up, right? Which there's huge communes in Venezuela, right? Like tens of thousands of people in some of these communes. And then this at a certain point can present the alternative to capitalism once we have created the conditions where this can build up and so on and so forth. There are different approaches to that kind of
Yeah.
question, but um that's just an interesting one to think about, maybe in the way that Robinson is thinking about it more.
Mm-hmm.
Because even in Gilbert's discussion of the communes, he talks about the influence of, Marinage and like African folks and their traditions, so combined with also, this Marxist, the Marxist inflection via Meszaros and Chavez, right? And so there are other ways than trying to
Yeah.
necessarily kind of build off of just capitalism and then we'll somehow socialize it at some point kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess he's saying that, and then another part to add to that, he has they have this conversation in this section about their analysis of women, right? Marx and Engels' analysis of women that that Engels claimed that Marx had agreed that the first instance of class oppression in history was coincident with the appearance of monogamy, with its intensification of the antagonism between men and women, and concomitant sexual and primordial division of labor for child breeding, right? But then, and this is the part where I'm like, let's see what you thought about that, right? Because it's like, then later they're like, but then they realize that the only way to emancipate women is then joining the workforce, right? Because they were being pushed off the workforce. Now it's join the workforce, and that's how revolution will happen. Not that the women could just free themselves, but that they had to join the working class to be able to free themselves, right? Now this has been a conversation, a critique, right, of Marxist feminism, the debates of like the wages for housework movement, right, and with the workforce, right. This has been an ongoing discussion within the Marxist tradition through a feminist lens, right. So it's not necessarily that it was outside of it. It's been a long-term conversation, and I've been really interested in those readings and reading about social reproduction. But often all of them often still go back to Engels and the origins of the family and the state and private property. That's like a fundamental text to unpack, right? But here he's saying that there was a contradiction for him, that they said this earlier, but then they said that women had to join the industrial working class in order to emancipate themselves, right? That there's that contradiction amongst their work. But I don't know. I don't really feel it was a contradiction, but he sees it as one. Right?
Yeah. I mean, and again, like, this is where on some level I'm not that interested in the question of whether Marx and Engels took a specific position on this. Like,
Yeah.
like, I think that they could have been, I mean, I think they were, if that's the position that they took, I think that they were wrong. But that, as you said, like, these are debates about like history or whatever, whereas like it's much more interesting how people relate to that within movements now. To me,
Mm-hmm.
what is that
Mm-hmm.
relationship? And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that it has to be beholden to Marx saying that they needed to join the industrial workforce. I mean, in the United States at this point, there basically is no industrial workforce. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
very, very small sector of the US economy at this point,
yeah.
and so a focus, I mean, so again, to talk about the Arlene Eisen discussion that we had this weekend for International Women's Day, she went and joined an organization called Seize the Time in the
Uh-huh.
70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she moved
Mm-hmm.
to Chicago and she got a factory job working in cutting steel
Okay.
and was trying to organize like anti-racists, you know, uh,
Yeah.
ideas within the workforce, right? And encountered all kinds of crap, encountered, white workers who
Mm-hmm.
call their names because she had a black partner at the time, right? Encountered, men who would fuck with her and wouldn't train her to do certain stuff
Mm-hmm.
and didn't want
Mm-hmm.
her taking their jobs and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but she was like, I don't like to talk about what we were trying to do because it sounds ridiculous nowadays. you know, because she's just like, how many how many factories are we trying to organize within the United States right now to
Yeah.
like start a revolution with anti-racist consciousness? Like, does anybody actually think that that's a
Mm-hmm.
revolutionary strategy right now? And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's laughable to her, but I was like, well, some people still do,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
you know, but I don't think we have any other choice but to have a much more expansive view at this
Yeah.
point. Like
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's again not to diminish that if people are in those spaces and they're, that they should be organizing and that they should trying to be develop class consciousness,
Of course.
revolutionary consciousness,
Of
internationalism.
course. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
please, right? Like that's important. But I think that I mean, if we look at the US, what might be considered industrial in a lot of it at this point is probably connected to the arms industry,
Mm-hmm.
which is like,
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, are you organizing to get people to quit their jobs? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
what
Yeah.
do you do in that context? It's sort of
Yeah.
a similar question of the difficulty of thinking about, people who want to organize around the police at this point. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how do you change the consciousness of workers whose livelihood is bound up in violence essentially?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very difficult question, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's the point that you bring up, and I guess that's what we're trying to think about at the time that he was writing this. Well, this is already 90s, but at the 80s, like, and even then, right? The idea that, well, if we don't have an industrial working class that in this place, that means there's no hope for a revolution here, then. Or that's and some people argue no, like the third world is view is like, no, you can't have one. There's no point to even think about it, right? But others are like, no, but that's also, the pushback to that was like, what do you do here? Just support third world movements? Yeah. Another aspect, well, you still got to organize people here for reforms and push back on things that could hopefully open up the position for movements abroad to build their strength and uh, but here it goes back to, if you have that very dogmatic view that no, it's going to happen here, then you completely ignore everything abroad, right? You ignore the movements that are actually really pushing back on imperialism, right? And so I think, again, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, I think his point of reference or his point of critique was that, right, was those that used Marxism to think that the revolution is only happening here and it's only going to happen in the Western world, right? And again, for a lot of us, we're already beyond that, right? For a lot of us, it's like, no, we already are pretty clear that, right, that's very limited in our scope. But that doesn't mean that the majority of folks that take this approach are that in that lens, right? I think there's still a large sector of movements that think that it's going to happen here, that this is where the most sophisticated movements are happening. And for a lot of us, it's not, right? You have to look towards the global south. right?
Yeah, I don't. To
Yeah,
me, that's
yeah,
like it's insane to think. I mean, I don't want to. I don't. Shouldn't use ableist language, but it's wild to think that that the United that the United States or that Europe have the most advanced like struggles or movements or prospects for and I'm not, again, like I don't say that to be defeatist, or to say that like there are no prospects at all. um I think we have objectively the bases, there for struggle, right? And for people to understand the world that they live in and that it needs a total transformation. Like it's all
hmm
there, you know.
hmm hmm
But I think that, yeah, I mean, you look at, I mean, it's like the jokes you guys make in the group chat, right? About like the difference between organizing in the Imperial Core and in South America, right? And like, like what that looks like on the ground of
yeah,
like,
yeah,
yeah, we organized 40,000 campesinos to go like, rush to the capital or something like that versus like, us. So like, well, we put together a rally of, 10 people, or we had a reading group with 100 folks or something like that.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you know, um, we have to do what we can and start where
yeah.
we
Of
are
course,
and
of
organize
course,
in the
of
ways that we
course,
do. But yeah,
of
I mean the
course.
movements, and I think the danger or the concern I always have around the third worldist impulse is that it becomes an excuse essentially not to do
hmm
the hard work, right?
hmm
And I'm not saying that everybody who's in that, that has that approach feels that way, but I think there's
Yeah,
a certain way when you read those texts that you can start to come to a like, oh, like there's nothing I can do from my
yeah,
position. The revolutionary agency has to come from there, and
hmm
all I can do is help it out a little bit, where I am. And I
yeah,
think that it can be, as I think doesn't have to be the case, because there's a lot of anarchists that do like real grassroots organizing, and I know some of them and they do great work. But you can also get a kind of individualist, anarchistic politics that's more of like a um aesthetic. I don't think this is as big a thing, but when I was growing up, like in Southern Oregon, that was what I would see is like kind of the individual punk with the like the circle A's, around and that kind of stuff. And it was like, it might be opposed to
yeah,
capitalism and certain things like that. But wasn't organized right in any kind of way. Just was like,
yeah,
I think that's a big problem in general and across tendencies actually is a kind of the branding of radicalism versus the actual
yeah,
organizing of radicalism.
yeah. Yeah, and I remember, when we were doing a lot of work in El Salvador, a lot of the criticisms that we would get from people is that our work was too focused out there, right? That we were looking towards El Salvador, not looking, trying to meet the needs of people here. And because for our view was, well, that's where we need to build the strength, right? And and obviously, there's many contradictions and to have to see in that moment, that we could definitely build off of. But I think that our view was still correct, that we were trying to build something outside of this place to give it the strength, right? To create its own sovereignty, right? To create its own ability to take care of itself out there and support those movements out there, right? Um, Now, but I think there could be there still could be a two-pronged approach where you build abroad and you still try to build from within, right? That has to happen. Like we still have to build here. I don't think, like you just said, like we can't have this as a defeatist attitude that we can't build an alternative in this place or challenge, create the conditions to support movements abroad. And again, and movements abroad say that all the time. When I'm in Cuba, you need to build your strength over there to support us here. Because I oftentimes my students, when they come with me to Cuba, they're like, "What can we do for you here?" Like, no, you guys need to build yourselves over there. Don't we talk about
Hmm.
us? We're doing fine here. We're trying to build our stuff here. Y'all need to build yourselves over there. What are you doing over there?
Yeah, exactly.
I remember one time when this one professor told the students, he comes, he's like, "What are you guys doing out there? How did you elect this guy? Like how like what are you doing out there?
Yeah.
Like what's going on? Like." And that was and it was coming from a genuine position. It was like he wasn't just clowning us. He was like literally like, "What are you doing out there? Like, are
Yeah.
you just like you guys want to come here and tell us, oh, you want to support us? Well, do something over there." And yeah, that's the part where we're at, where we need to do that, right? But you know, I think that's again these ideas that he's picking at are found in these problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this was a good chapter on the whole. Like, even if I would, if my whatever qualms or footnotes or whatever, I want to put hashtag not all Marxists on. Um, but I think that you know I think that there's definitely a tendency, right? And it does reflect itself through certainly some of the work of Marx and Engels, right? And I mean, my approach to a lot of that has been to not necessarily do what Robinson does, right? And obviously, and go through like the anthropology of these movements and
Yeah,
these thinkers but to say that Marx was looking at certain things and analyzing them from where he sat in it. And he was like, one of the things I would say is that missing from this book, at least, is any significant discussion with kind of some of those later Marx as he's looking at indigenous movements, as he's looking at, the Russian peasant, commune. And I know Robinson was aware of that because I think he actually even cites that briefly in Black Marxism or something. Um, but he doesn't really engage that, which I always find a little bit problematic because if you're if you're going to critique Marx, which is fine, I think you also have to talk about how he evolved on some of these questions and whether the critique you're making that might be valid on something that he wrote in the 1840s, 1850s, or whatever is still valid on the things that he wrote at the very end of his life or the things that Engels started to write at the end of his life.
yeah,
Um, you know, and so there's a value, but to me it's also like, and I think this is something I referenced early on, to me his interventions would be stronger if he was very context specific to the texts, to the you know because he doesn't necessarily he does this longer contextualization, but he doesn't necessarily contextualize it then in relation to, say, Marx and Engels' life or organizing in the period that they were writing those texts, right? Or how their position changed as they encountered different positions and situations, right? So he has particular axes to grind, which I think are worth grinding, but doesn't leave a little bit open for the fact that like these are growing, learning people that also evolve themselves, and then the body of work that we would call Marxism evolves a whole lot in all kinds of different ways,
yeah,
after them as well.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And I wonder if folks, because it's important, like you mentioned, all this literature that comes out later, right? That gets translated to English for a lot of us to read about later Marx's later work. A lot of us don't necessarily engage that though. That's like a lot of us are not reading those things. We're reading all this other text, these classical texts, right? And there's
Right.
new scholars that are engaging this stuff and really disseminating it for us to read, which I think now is the time to do it, right? Now that it exists, there's a lot more literature now that we could engage of Marx's later work that wasn't around before, right? That I think we should start looking at, that people are not looking at. So
Yeah.
definitely, I think that's an important point, right? And it goes back to the same thing what he's doing, right? Like kind of like what I oftentimes do with folks that critique his work. That's like, well, are you engaged in Robinson's work or just Black Marxism, right? Because there's so much more than just Black. That's what we're doing this today, right?
Hmm.
that folks that do engage his work are just engaging Black Marxism, and there's so much more to his work beyond just that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I've had different discussions with people around that. And I think in both of their cases, we could say there's kind of a double-edged
Yeah.
sword to that, right? Which is like that. I mean, with Marx and Robinson, I think his I'd say it's to the detriment a little bit of the work that he's doing, that he is not more specific in certain instances, right? And tends to generalize certain things. Um, but I think to the extent that people do that with Robinson as well, I think
Hmm.
both cases there's a value in critiquing the texts to the extent that you know, like for instance, just to take Black Marxism for example, this text has taken on a very important role in the last 20 years, and not one that it had in 1983 when it
Yeah.
came out, right? And it has influenced a lot of people. I don't know that it's influenced them enough, because a lot of times people will just use the word, right, racial capitalism or whatever, and you're like, I don't think you really
Yeah.
know what Robinson's talking about here.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but I think that that to that extent, right, there is a value in people looking at that text and saying, okay, if it's being promoted in this way, we need to actually be able to like summarize the interventions that are being made and determine whether we agree or disagree with
Hmm.
some of those interventions, right?
Yeah.
um so there's a value there, but again, I think the problem becomes in this like desire to use either of these approaches to like dismiss,
Hmm.
because yeah, I mean, like, it's funny. So Mtume did the Forgeries of Memory and Meaning thing, with me last year, and he and I both really, really like that book. I mean, I think it's like one of the best books about the
I think so too.
early Hollywood and early film industry. It's just excellent.
Yeah.
And I don't, well, I wouldn't want to hurt Robinson's feelings by calling it Marxist. It has a very like it's very
It's
intense to like,
materialist. It's a materialist
it's
thing. Yeah. Yeah.
materialist. He's looking at the
Yeah. Yeah.
ruling
Yeah. Yeah.
class. He's looking at what the
Yeah.
capitalists. He looks at the railroads and the
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
industries, right? He looks at the working classes and what they're doing. He looks at imperialism constantly,
Hmm.
Mexico,
Hmm.
Russia.
Hmm.
Like he
Hmm.
looks at all of these things.
Yeah.
Um, and so it is a very materialist text for sure. Um, but Mtume, when he's been reading through this with us a little bit and listening to our conversations, and I think he shares some of the like frustrations around
Of course.
some
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
like, paint everything with a like painting Marxism all with the same brush, to a
Hmm.
certain degree,
Hmm.
right? Which
Hmm.
um I don't know, you know, it's a weird thing because it's like it doesn't seem fully like that's what the project of it is, but there are certain ways that in his conclusions, sometimes I guess I would say I disagree with some of his conclusions on
Hmm.
some of this stuff.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
in this chapter in particular, I really agree with his conclusion. The question is whether, we say that this is a product of Marxism, right? Or is it a product of the kind of European tradition that they're coming out of, and it's something that can be critiqued within Marxism and moved on beyond,
Yeah. And I think it's the second part. I think it's more
Yeah.
important for me, right? For me, it's more important than, because again, like for me, when I read anything, it's like, how will this be useful for my own work, but also for my way of thinking and for my way of acting and being in the world and organizing in the world? Will this be useful, right? How is it useful? And it doesn't necessarily have to be Marxist in that sense, right? Like I don't have to read a Marxist text to be like, oh, this is useful. Although, obviously in my work, I try to engage primarily Marxist texts because I think in the world I'm in, it's very anti-Marxist, right? In the work I do around me, it's very anti-Marxist. So like, how do I engage Marxism to get people, the generations after me, to see that you can engage it and it is productive and it is useful for us to understand the world, right? And so for me, like when I read these texts, I'm not reading it with my Marxist defensive defense on, because I know that this is not going to necessarily take away from my analysis. It's actually going to help me build. And so in that second part where you just mentioned, the second part of what you just said is like, well, then how do I see the potential limits or gaps or erasures if I continue just to follow that Western tradition, right? And not build off of Fanon. Because again, I go back to that. I think like Entume, like yourself, like a lot of us have built our Marxism through the lens of Fanon, through the lens of Cabral, right? Through the lens of the Salvadorans that I've met, right? Our Marxism comes through these views. So it's already in a way, I don't want to say distorted, but it already has a lens that's more through the third world, right? So it's filtered through that lens. And so when we're reading him, some of us are like, well, yeah, I see that already, right? And for some of us, we might read like, no, this is an attack on Marxism. I'm like, no, it's pretty much what a lot of our mentors have already said to us through their own writings, through their own thing, through their own practice, have shown us the gaps, right? And so just that this dude's coming from an outside of a Marxist position, right? Where he's like, you all are enveloped in your Marxism. Y'all need to see outside of it. Well, some of us came in already with those lenses. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the problem becomes, and I think about my conversations with Jared Ball around this, and we've talked about it with relation to Afro-pessimism as well. He and I, is that like, the issue to me is people reading it, what conclusions do they come away with?
Yeah.
Right. And what are they bringing into reading it, and what are they taking out of reading it? Right. And like, I think there is a danger from my point of view that people can read it as a dismissal, or as, I don't know. I mean, it'll be interesting. I haven't, interest to revisit the last chapter as well as like the preface and the forward. Like, and we'll talk about it next week, kind of our final analysis and what do we take away from it as a whole. Because I think that you definitely can have people who will be like, well, like Marxism has all these issues, and so like, we're gonna go over here, right? And I think that's the challenge sometimes, is that, and to some extent, like with Black Marxism, a lot of people, particularly 15 years ago, or well, not that long ago, 10 years ago, right, were encouraged to kind of like, this is the book that you have to read, right?
Yeah.
And I
I
think,
remember that moment. Yep.
yeah, and I think it's like, I mean, I read it in study groups. I've read it probably 4 times at this point. And it has a lot. There's a lot in it that I consider like really useful and valuable, that I still incorporate into how I think about certain things. But there's also a lot that I think could be very politically confusing to people if they don't have a foundation in like movements, as well as like, having, whether you call it Marxism, scientific socialism, dialectical materialism, whatever you want to call it. Like, if you don't have some basis in that, then you could come away with it with a text of like, oh, that stuff has really, it has mistreated all these brilliant Black revolutionaries, right? And we don't need it because we have our own tradition of struggle. And there is that other tradition of struggle for sure, right? But that's also like, there's plenty of people who have pulled from both, is what we're talking about, right? Like, pulled from both whatever history of struggle you have, but also the tools that are elaborated by these revolutionaries as well. So yeah. And somebody said in the chat too that Chavez is not a Marxist, and I don't want to get into the the debate about this, but part of what I wanted to say too is, it's like, I mean, when I'm approaching it that point of view, I'm talking about specifically his relationship to Messaros, who was a Marxist. And their work together, they had a
Yeah.
long collaboration with each other and the development of communal theory out of that. So whether he called himself a Marxist or people think that he's a, that this is a deviation from Marx, that's a whole different kind of debate. But that's what I mean. And I think that's the thing is it's like the difficulty of the word Marxism too, of sometimes people like for me it's a shorthand a lot of the time. It's not me saying, the religion of revolution, from Marx or, our great leader Marx or something like that. It's a shorthand. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a proprietary impulse attached to it other than to say when I read Cabral, he is using tools that are developed through Marxism that he learned in his own relationship with the Portuguese Communist Party when he was in Lisbon, and where he also disagreed with them, right? Around these very questions as well of who were the revolutionary agents, what do we do? Should we organize in the metropole? Do we organize in the colonies? Like all of these kind of questions were central. But you can't deny, in my view, like that there's an influence of that theory and that methodology within the work that he does. So yeah. All right.
Yeah, I would say the same thing with Fanon, right? Some people say he's not a Marxist, and I
Right.
go back to the right, and I would still think that he is also using a lot of the frameworks of Marx, right? The idea of right questioning the foundations of Marxism to be like, well, there's something's missing here, yeah. So I think that the proprietary impulse is, I think, the point here that's important to unpack more, right? That Cedric's inviting us to think about, right? When we think about Marxism and how we work with it. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So next week we will wrap up. We will read the last chapter, which is only like
Well, one last part here, I think, just before we
go
finish,
ahead.
is that how he ends it, and I think this part is probably a controversial statement that I think later on we'll probably engage again because Avery Gordon in her preface or introduction engages it, right? But I'll end it. This is the last paragraph on page 116. Notwithstanding their keen appetites for history, Marx and Engels had chosen to obliterate the most fertile discursive domain for their political ambitions and historical imaginations, meaning the socialisms of medieval Europe, right? Possibly even less troubling for them, they displaced a socialist motivation grounded on the insistence that men and women were divine agents for the factitious and weaker allegiance of class. Right, so that instead of viewing again this historical relationship to socialism as something that's just a divine agent, quote unquote, that we were just allegiances to class, that it's our class background that shapes our relationship to socialism rather than actually the impulse of our humanity to fight back against oppression, right? That's how I read the divine agent part. I don't know, some people could read it as more idealistic, that it's just a spirit, which I think he actually gets into later on with the idea of spirit. But for me, it's just the impulse of resistance that's just in us. It
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily have to be the idea of class, right? That a lot of us get bogged down on, right? Again, I'm always constantly pushing people back. The class analysis, where is it? But that's not to say that that's all we are, right? We're more than that, but oftentimes we don't have a class analysis to what we're studying. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we can revisit that a little bit next week,
Yeah.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it is an important thing. I mean, I certainly don't want to, in thinking about, this question of like who can revolutionary subjects be and all of that, I still think it is very important to understand exploitation, to understand expropriation, to understand um class and
Mm-hmm.
and have a class analysis, right? um and I think that's one thing that maybe I haven't quite figured out how I feel about some of the things Robinson's doing with regard to that in this text, because there's a certain way that he wants to kind of explain the development of class analysis and the antecedents of it within European history. But then he has a way of sort of calling Marx's way of doing it bourgeois, which I
Mm-hmm.
find very, like, I don't think so. Like, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it comes from, like, you could say it's bourgeois in the extent that it's academic to a certain way. You could say
Yeah.
it's, you know, petty bourgeois or bourgeois in its maybe in its presentation in certain ways and that kind of stuff. But I don't, you know, I don't even see the question of the exclusions that Marx is making from a point of view, from a bourgeois point of view necessarily. I think that he, I think in the moment that they were in, these factories going up everywhere and what was going on, I think he and Engels believed that what needed to happen was the industrial workers had to
Mm-hmm.
organize, could do so on the shop floor because they shared the exploitation,
Yeah.
and that they could overthrow this system and that they could democratize it. And because of the development of these productive forces, this now gave a basis where the socialisms of these that Robinson's talking about in this book, where these medieval and utopian and communal
Mm-hmm.
projects actually could have
Yeah.
a organic basis that you could say, okay, well, we could feed everybody with this. We could,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
figure out how we're going to distribute this labor differently and this, you know, the wealth or whatever differently. And
Yeah.
so I don't read that as a
Yeah.
bourgeois impulse. I don't read
Yeah.
it as one that's in the interests of Marx and Engels even.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, because they
Yeah.
could have just been academics and just, you know, lived a good
Yeah.
life being functionaries of the ruling class if they wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. He could live off of his profit, off of his surplus value. Engels could have just chilled out, you know.
yeah,
He owned
like
his
shit, my
parents owned the
parents own
factory.
factories. I'm gonna
Yeah,
inherit these
yeah, yeah, yeah.
factories. This is great. Fuck these
I'm gonna go
Irish
and
workers.
I'm gonna go enjoy the I'm gonna go enjoy the beaches in Mexico. You know?
Yeah, yeah. And so yeah, I think that's something that I struggle a little bit to contend with in some of Robinson's characterizations here, particularly his emphasis on locating certain things as bourgeois when, again, the if any, I mean, you could say it's like it's too limited in its orientation of the proletariat or something like that, but I don't think that functionally, I don't think it serves a bourgeois interest. Yeah. Anyway. All right. Thanks again. This has been great. We'll wrap
Yeah,
it up next week.
for
And
sure.
yeah, shout out to everybody in the chat
All right.
for joining us.
Again, I appreciate everyone in the chat, the comments. You know, I really appreciate the engagement. You know,
Yeah.
thank
Oh, I
you.
should look through. Let me go through a few things in the
Yeah, for
chat. Yeah,
sure.
there's some good stuff. So Dwayne Monroe, our good friend, says Gabriel Rockhill in his book "Who Paid the Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism" demolishes the entire school of thought from which Foucault emerged as counterinsurgent. Yeah, a lot of I have you read it yet, Stephen? I haven't read it yet.
The book, I've looked through some pages. Yeah, I haven't read it completely,
Yeah,
but the book doesn't necessarily. It's not on Foucault yet. I think that's
yeah,
going to be the next. I think he wrote it's like a 3 volume, but he's published something on Foucault, right? But
he
um,
has, and
this one
they just
and the Frankfurt School.
yeah, and he has written about Foucault and French theory before, and there's actually this month's monthly review
Mhm.
press, which I or monthly review journal, which I haven't read all of yet, but it has some stuff from both him and John Bellamy Foster on
Yeah,
French theory,
French
you
theory.
know, and you know, so yeah,
And you know, but I really appreciate the last chapter of that book, of the anti-imperialist Marxism, right, versus the Western Marxism, like the what
hmm
he's making the difference as, right? And again, I go back to, you know, as much as Cedric wasn't necessarily a Marxist, I think that's where he was kind of like moving us towards. Like, why aren't we looking at these movements, taking these other movements more seriously, these ones that have engaged Marxism on their own terms,
yeah.
right? And I
There's
think that's,
also
you know,
yeah,
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 that's where I find it useful to think about.
yeah, for sure. And I mean that could be one of the challenges of a text like this, right? Because on some level, I think what Robinson's doing is he's trying to speak of a certain tendency which does exist within Marxists of dismissing movements,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because say, well, because that's not Marxists, right? Or they're not Marxists, right? Like I'm not going to get involved in this, organize in it, engage, etc., right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a tendency that we have to be, wary of, or has its
Yeah.
challenges. I mean, there's plenty of critiques of movementism as well within,
Of course.
communist organizing and but I think on the flip side, what you're talking about too is a challenge that in some ways Robinson's project could be seen as dovetailing with, which is like a focus or an emphasis on all of these, on just struggles, like all kinds of different sorts of struggles, rather than saying, what can we learn from the history of these communist movements or these, Marxist movements or whatever. Yeah. Frank, hello from Argentina. I hate Foucault. He's a good historian, but in his theory, there is no way out. And in general, he is he is in the side of politics is war by other ways. And I think that's the main difference between Foucault and at least my local Marxists. Yeah. I mean,
same.
Yeah,
I agree. Definitely.
I agree. I'd even say that every denier of revolutionary Marxism always pendulates. Suddenly, Marx is too radically. Suddenly, he was a European white man. Yeah. Marxism and Native Americans, I haven't read this book, has a materialist critique of Marxism that accounts for third world use of Marx, but not a fourth world understanding, which led to some terrible Marxist engagements with indigenous people. I have to check that out, Pancho. That's a good,
me too. Yeah.
Good recommendation. So interesting because many critiques find that Marxist-Leninists treat Marxism like a religion. Yeah, I mean, you can get this. You can get this like appeal to scripture or dogma.
Are we talking about like hagiography? Is that the phrase he uses?
Yeah, or just like well, I don't know. I don't know the context of the critiques that he's talking about specifically, but I think you can get an appeal to like say, oh, well, the question that you have right now, it is answered in 1867 in this book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
I appreciated this. In socialism, we joined a production brigade producing machines or harvesting potatoes on a combine. Our strength is in diversity. We are 8 billion strong. Many ways lead us to communism. Communism is another word for diversity without commodities. Appreciate that. What were you going to say?
No. I lost my train of thought. That was a good point, but I lost my train of thought.
Indofied said, catching up, overall Western Marxism misses disability justice and cultural subjugation in ways that communities of culture subject to market value tethered to casteism have had to address. That's a very interesting comment. I mean, the disability justice point I could definitely see because of the emphasis on the productive worker and so on. I think that always the seed within Marxism that, it's a phrase and it's, been said a million times. And I'm sure I'm not saying something that this person has not, heard a million times. But the thing within Marxism that I always appreciate is the from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, ID, right? And this idea that, that there was even from that particular phrase an emphasis on ability, and you could say by relation disability as well, right? And it's much easier to say as a maxim than it is to actually like figure out how do we live this in practice all the time, right?
For sure.
So yeah. Yeah, this is Ali Kadri. Death itself is on sale under the rule of monopoly capitalism. As long as it is allowed, it will continue to push forward an exploitative agenda like an avalanche, always growing in size. Yeah, I know. I mean, you probably are not quoting Ali Qadri there, but that is a good
That's it right
summary.
there. Yeah.
All right. All right. I think
All right, man.
that's a good place for us to close up. Thanks again, Stephen.
Yeah, for sure.
And
No, thank
we'll
you.
be back.
Thank you again.
We'll
Thanks,
we'll
everyone.
be back next week. Yeah, thank you. All right, peace.
Cool.